Hi folks, CALC here in the studio, and today we've got a very exciting video for you. This is a preview, a first look at what we've been busy with over at Novation, and this is the Novation Summit synthesizer. So what is Summit? Well, it is a 16-voice bitimbral synth based around the same synth engine as we developed for the Peak synthesizer. We're using the field programmable gate array, the FPGA, as the processor to provide us with our incredibly high resolution digital oscillators, which are then passed through into the analog domain through the filters and the distortions and the amplifiers. Incredible sounding instrument. And the Summit is effectively like having two peaks crammed inside a keyboard. The keyboard, the keybed, feels absolutely fantastic. It's a custom-built professional keybed, and inside this full metal chassis of the Summit, it just feels stunning. And of course, we've got all our top-level controls as well. So if you're familiar with the Peak, you'll recognise quite a lot of the layout of this Summit. Indeed, we've got some additional tweaks, and we've built on the Peak Synth Engine, which we'll take a look at. But essentially, the workflow is very, very similar to the Peak. So I mentioned it's 16 voice, and we can use the Summit in a single patch mode and access all 16 of those voices for a single patch, or we can turn it into a bitimbral synth and effectively split it into two separate synth engines, which we can of course play both from the keyboard, or we can also send MIDI sequences in and control them separately as well. It's a real powerhouse of a synthesizer. As I mentioned before, Summit is a 16-voice synthesizer, and that means I can play up to 16 individual notes at the same time on the instrument. Each of those 16 voices has access to 3 oscillators, and of course the filters, the envelopes, and the 2 voice level LFOs as well. I mean, if you consider the oscillators themselves, there are 48 of the Oxford oscillators being generated inside this synthesizer. Of course, we can use the 16 voices to play all 16 notes from the same patch at the same time. So, you know, you can make huge unison patches, or you can, you know, make huge orchestral chord voicings as well using those 16 voices. But equally, using the multi-mode, we can then split this into 2 separate 8-voice synths as well. So alongside being a 16-voice synth, Summit can also be split into 2 8-voice synthesizers. We effectively call this a multi, and a multi is a combination of 2 different synthesizer patches. So they can be completely different patches, of course. You can play them from the keyboard, or you can send MIDI sequences directly into Summit on separate MIDI channels and control them that way. This makes Summit a very, very powerful synthesizer in both the studio environment, but also, of course, on stage as well. So to manage a multi, we'll just simply go into the multi section here, and of course you'll see now my controls light up on the left hand side of the synth, and now I'm able to take control of, for example, part A, or switch through to part B, or if I press both of these together, I can actually play both parts at the same time. So we've got a very powerful way of being able to control the 2 individual sounds. Now, in our multi-part control section here, you'll see, yeah, as I've said, we've got our part A and part B selector here, but underneath that, we've also got 3 different modes that we can address as well. In the layer mode, basically, it's going to co-join parts A and part B together at the same time, and I play the voices from both synth engines there. And if I go to split, we can now put a key split on the keyboard and create 2 different regions that we can control the 2 different sounds from. So the split is generally set to C3 by default. So there we go, that's part A. If I play on the top here, I'm now getting both parts, but obviously played separately, independently, across a key split point of C3. Finally, we have the dual mode as well, and this is a very powerful mode, especially if we're going to use the Summit in conjunction with external sequencing. In the dual mode, we have the part A addressed individually, part B addressed individually as well. And as we saw earlier, if I press both of them together, I can play both parts together. But in the dual mode, effectively part A is listening to one MIDI channel, part B is listening to another MIDI channel, and of course then if we send in a sequence using those two MIDI channels, we can have it split so that we have two completely independently controlled sounds. So let's take a good look at the top panel of the Summit, and you'll see that it's very similar in layout to the Peak synthesizer, but there are some additional features that are on there. So for example, if you look over here at our envelope shapes, we have long throw faders. These are a longer throw than the Peak, and that means that we've got a lot more kind of fine control over the envelope shaping. We've also added the envelope loop button on the top panel as well, and this means we can very quickly just turn on envelope looping just by the simple tap of a button. That's really nice, and that can really help with the sound design as well. Generally, the flow is pretty much the same as the Peak synth. We're not going to go into the Synth Engine kind of details too much now. There's plenty of information about the Peak synthesizer. But what we do have are some nice new kind of features as well. So for example, over at this section here, we've exposed the arpeggiator controls. Previously, they were just sitting in a menu, but now we actually have these top level controls. Things like the octave switch here, the type of arpeggiator you want to use, the gate control as well, the rhythms as well. This is really quite a nice control to have here. These give you different arpeggiator rhythms that have been preset inside, and of course we have a tempo knob as well. So by exposing just these arpeggiator controls, all of a sudden we've got a lot more performance-y based stuff that we can do using the arpeggiator. Above that, of course, you'll see now that we've also got a voice mode switch as well. And this means we can switch through poly, mono, different kinds of settings for the types of voices that we're creating when we're doing our sound design. Okay, if you look over to the right hand side of the synthesizer as well, you'll see we've got a dedicated control for the global LFOs. These are the global LFOs that were added into the Peak engine to allow you to control effects in the effects modulation matrix. But of course, we've now exposed the controls for those LFOs here on the top panel as well. You can simply choose between LFO3 and LFO4, the different wave shapes that we use for the LFO. There's a sync switch as well, and of course we have a rate pot. Perhaps some of the most powerful additional controls on the top panel of Summit is the fact that we've also exposed the FM frequency modulation controls. I'll just initialize this patch and move to a single sine wave oscillator here, oscillator 1, and by turning up this control, I'm now allowing oscillator 3 to frequency modulate oscillator 1. Let's put oscillator 3 on a sine as well. Again, if I use the controls here, you can hear that wonderful FM sound ring through. Now, these controls here, oscillator 3 into oscillator 1, oscillator 1 then frequency modulating oscillator 2, and finally oscillator 2 frequency modulating oscillator 3. And each of these controls also has three different states, three different types of control. So here is a manual. This is the amount of FM that you can apply. But equally, I can go to my mod envelope 2 here, switch to mod envelope 2, make it just a very quick shape here. So a bit of attack and decay. You can just hear that at the beginning. Now we can use the mod envelope and the manual independently. So I might want to just change the position of where the FM starts with the envelope. Do that now. Bring that down a touch. So you can see that the manual control, the control for choosing how much FM, is separate really from the envelope control. And finally, we also have an additional control, which is the LFO control, and this now allows us to use LFO2 to increase and decrease the amount of FM going on between them. If I bring in oscillator 2, here's oscillator 2, let's put this onto a sine as well. Now you see I can use the manual control here. Alongside the powerful, cool new way that we can control the FM aspect of the synthesizer, we've also had a couple of tweaks and a couple of additions to the Synth Engine for Summit. For example, here we have our noise generator. Just turn the oscillators down, and if I go to my oscillator menu, you'll see now that we have a high pass filter which we can apply just to the noise. We have a low pass, of course, but the high pass is actually a new aspect to this engine. Perhaps one of the most powerful additions to the Summit engine is the new dual filter mode. This is a fully analog filter. Actually, it's the same filter design as the one that we have used on Peak, which in turn was a development from the Base Station 2, and in fact was also development on the original filter design that Chris Huggett produced in the late 1970s for the EDP Wasp. As I say, it's the same shared filter design as we have in Peak, although now we have a different way to manage it. Of course, it's a multi-mode filter and we can switch between low pass, band pass and high pass, but if I switch down to this section, on mine it's a prototype device, it says more. I think it will actually say dual on the finished synth, but in here we access a brand new dual filter mode. So how does this new dual filter mode work? Well, if we switch down to dual filter, you'll see that we open up a new menu here, and this is giving us the opportunity to choose how we arrange the filter. If we think about a 24 dB filter, effectively what we've got here is two 12 dB filters in series with each other. So for example, if I switch to my low pass filter here and just use a 24 dB slope here, we've got a slightly more aggressive kind of way of cutting out the frequencies with the cutoff pop here. If we go to a 12 dB filter, it's a little bit less aggressive. But the 24 dB filter is basically two 12 dB filters in series with each other. These are both low pass filters and they have a common cutoff position. And by using it this way, this is giving us a 24 dB slope. Now, if I switch through to the more or dual mode, as it will be on the final product, if I look at my menu here, I'm now given the option to say, okay, let's split this into two 12 dB filter blocks. So here we have a low pass going into a high pass. And if I use the cutoff position now, you see we've got a completely different sound there. If I increase the resonance, you can hear that the resonant peaks there are very close together. So what we also have is a really powerful thing called the filter frequency separation. Now, if I just hold down a chord, down here, and now if I separate the two cutoff positions using the filter separation, you can hear we have a completely different sound now. It's almost like having two filters on a single sound. So this opens up a whole new world of sound designing possibilities. It's a very powerful system. Now, if I go to my filter shape here, you'll see that I can have a low pass going into a high pass. This effectively will give us a band pass type of filter, but obviously using the separation, we can increase the bell size, if you like, the position or the amount of frequency that's allowed to pass through in that middle band of the band pass. But if I move up, I have a low pass going into a band pass, I have a high pass going into a band pass, and if I move across now, you'll see we have a little plus sign in between them. This now means that the filters are in parallel. So previously we had our filters in serial, the signal would pass through one filter through into the other, but now when we go into parallel mode, basically the oscillators, the sound generators are going to go into the filter at exactly the same time, into two separate filters. So here I've got it set to a low pass filter, and I'm going to go to a sine wave on my synth. Now because we've got the resonance up, we've got a second sine wave there as well. The filter is in self-oscillation. We can hear a second sine wave, but if we listen to the separation now, You can now hear we've actually got two resonant peaks on the sound. In fact, if I bring out the oscillator one, we have two perfect sine waves produced in the analog filter, and if we bring in the oscillator as a third sine wave sound, we get some nice kind of almost additive sort of sounds there. Okay, also with the filter separation control, this is addressable in the mod matrix. So here we've just got that sine wave sound again, but if I go to my destination in the mod matrix and move all the way to the end here, I've got my filter frequency separation, and let's apply a bit of LFO to this. So let's go to LFO 1 and let's put an amount on. So now you can now hear that separation of the filters moving around. Of course, we've got a resonant filter sound here, so let's just take the resonance off a little bit and have a quick listen to what's going on. Let's get some more energy in the oscillator here. You can hear how that's really having quite a nice effect. Again, maybe I'll switch to a sample and hold here. And you can get some really nice effects. And this is effectively just moving those two filter blocks further apart and bringing them back together with the LFO. As part of the Summit, we've also added an audio input. This means you can send any stereo or indeed mono sound through the Summit and into the wonderful sounding effects. The reverb that Chris Huggett designed for the Peak synthesizer sounds stunning, and now we can send any audio signal we like and process it through that reverb, but of course through the chorus and the delay as well. In fact, if you want to, you can send your audio signal at the voice level. So that means it will pass then through the filter, the analog filter, the three analog distortions before going on into the wonderful sounding digital effects at the end of the chain. Alongside the audio input, we've of course got two sets of stereo outputs. We have our main outputs and the auxiliary outputs. Inside the menu, we've got a very clever routing system as well. So for example, if I'm working in a multi, I might want to send part A out of the main outputs and part B out of the auxiliary outputs instead. I may decide that I want to monitor through my headphones from the main output, or equally, I can choose to listen to what's coming out of the auxiliary outputs also. If we move to the next page in the settings menu, you can see we're on our effects sources page. The Summit, as we found out earlier, is a bitimbral synthesizer. We can split it into two separate synth engines, and in actual fact we have two separate effects processors in here as well. We have twice the amount of reverb, twice the amount of delay, and twice the amount of chorus. In the effects sources page, I can choose what I want to be sent into those effects. You can see here that I've got effects A. The effects block for part A is being fed by the synth. But if I wanted to keep the synth nice and clean without effects, but maybe process some external audio through the effects exclusively, I can easily set that now to just external. If I move up, of course, I can have both the synth and the external audio flow running through the effects if I choose. As I say, this is completely independent for part A and for part B. Here I've got a very basic sequence programmed up in circuit, and I'm also taking the MIDI out from circuit into the Summit. In this piece, I'm going to have Synth 1 on circuit and Synth 2 on circuit, controlling part A and part B independently. But equally, I'm running the audio, the drum samples, through the audio processing aspect of Summit as well. I'll just hit play. And this is the overall tune. Now, at the moment, we don't need the bass line. I'll just mute that. Now I'm going to move to part B here, and I'm going to just quickly turn down the oscillators and the filter a bit, because that's actually on a self-resonant filter sound. Now you can hear the drum samples are being passed through the filter here and through the effects. So of course I can use the powerful analog distortions here as well. Get a bit of LFO on the filter. If We sync that to a nice sort of speed. Again, we're running through the reverb here as well and the delays. If we take those down, you can now hear that drum sample just running through the distortions and filters of the Synth Engine. If I want to take this audio signal out of the chain, out of the source running through the filter and into the effects, I go to my voice menu. I have a switch here for audio input. You can see at the minute this is going pre-filter. Effectively, it's going in before the filter and then is being processed by the filter. If I switch to post-filter, it's now just running through the effects. And of course, if I want to, I can just completely disconnect it from the Synth Engine completely. Using the Summit as an audio processor is one of my favourite things to do with it, and it's incredibly powerful. It can yield some really unusual results. Just applying filter sweeps and maybe some modulation on that filter to an incoming audio signal just really takes it into another place completely. But what's really quite fascinating as well is I'll hit play here, I can send the audio input through the filter of part B here. If I go to part A and also turn the audio input on, once part A is receiving some notes as well, we're actually processing this audio twice through the two separate synth engines. This is incredibly powerful because now we have effectively 2 filter effects, 6 distortion effects, 2 reverbs, 2 delays and 2 choruses. It's very powerful indeed. So there we go, a good first look at the Novation Summit synthesizer. We're incredibly excited about this instrument and we really can't wait to see what you guys are going to be able to do with it once we've got it into your hands. Thanks very much for watching.